signed it, either go sign it or maybe someone could pass that around so everyone has a chance to sign in. Second thing is, I think next Sunday is our 5th Sunday of the month. And every 5th Sunday, we don't have Sunday school. We have, I think, a single service and then a supper. So we will, again, not be meeting next Sunday, but then we'll be meeting that following Sunday and continuing on through the month of June and actually into the beginning of July. This is technically our spring classes, but with all the weather we had in the winter, we had to kind of push those classes back, so we're doing a little bit of catch-up now. Since we met 2 weeks ago, someone raised a question and a comment to me, and I thought I would respond to that in this setting so I could respond to all of you. It was kind of twofold. The one was a comment that perhaps the last class that we had was a bit confusing. Now, I failed to reach out to the person whether he was referring to me, and perhaps I presented the information in a confusing way, and if so, that's on me, and I would ask you to please let me know if that's the case so we can try to clarify things. But I think perhaps he was more thinking that the material itself came across a little bit confusing. And actually, if that's the case, that's a good thing. Because as I hope you remembered when we started this class, we talked about the fact that the world, the society in which we live, particularly when it comes to right and wrong, is confused. And as we look at different theories as it relates to the standards by which we judge right and wrong, and as we look to where does the authority come from by which we utilize these standards, from the world's standpoint, there isn't any consensus. And so that confusion exists. It was suggested, and perhaps rightly so, maybe the starting point for this class should have been, here's a Christian perspective, and then we'll take a look at these others. Maybe that would have been a better route to go. I chose the way that we're doing this, though, for a specific reason. In part, I don't want this to be a class where I'm saying, this is what I think you should believe about this subject or this subject. I think I would be doing you a disservice if we go about it that way. I would much prefer to give you the tools so that you, by the grace of God and through the Holy Spirit, yourself can discern as different issues come along, in your life. And perhaps I can use this as an opportunity just to share a little bit about my philosophy as relates to teaching. I learned this many years ago, and I think it's wise. When you're teaching a subject, you should teach at or preferably one level above where your audience is. And I'll share this class. What I'm sharing with you is college level, and some is seminary level as well. I think that's good. If you attend a class and you don't learn anything new, then the teacher really isn't teaching anything. So the intent here is that you're getting information that you haven't heard before, things that are new, and some of this is tough. I admit that. Some of this is very abstract. But again, I remind you when we talked about what's the greatest command, and part of that greatest command is that we love the Lord our God with all our minds. And I take that very seriously, and I believe you do as well. This is a class where I'm asking you to exercise your minds as we study these subjects. And again, it isn't just for our own benefit, although I hope it is. I hope this does bring edification to our lives, more confidence as we address issues as it relates to ethics. But honestly, my passion is that you'll use this when you reach out to those that don't know Christ as their Savior, to those who have these different worldviews as it relates to what's right and what's wrong and where these values come from. That's my desire and my passion, that you'll leave this class with a greater confidence. I can assure you, if you hang in there with me, and if I do at least a half-decent job of presenting this, you're going to know more about ethics than probably 90+% of the people that you engage with. And again, it's so helpful when you're engaging with someone that you understand where they're coming from before you go and present where you're coming from and what your worldview is. So hang in there with me. Again, as I shared at the beginning, the plan was to provide some definitions, go into why it is that we think this is a class worth attending, then looking at those 3 branches of ethics, which is what we're in the middle of right now. And then after that, the next step is guidance on how do we make our decisions. And I know that's where we're eager to get. But I ask with you to hang in there with me on this section right now. We're going to cover this a little bit more today and next week. But I think this is foundational for where we want to go. So stick with me on this. And I hope in the long run you'll see that this has been a profitable time. So just very quickly, maybe not so quickly. There we go. Just since we didn't meet last week, just by way of review, let's go over just a couple of things here. Remember we talked about the 3 branches of ethics. We said there was applied ethics, normative ethics, and meta-ethics. Applied ethics is what are the subjects that we're going to be discussing, whatever it may be. It might be war, it might be stealing, it might be, what do we do about, paying our taxes? Do we have to pay them, or can we kind of fudge a little bit? Whatever the ethical topic is, that's what falls under applied ethics. It's called applied because we're applying the standards or the rules that we find in normative ethics. And we're going to be getting into that this morning. Normative ethics tries to give us standards or rules that we use to apply to the individual subjects we're examining, so we know exactly how to evaluate and determine what is a proper and perhaps an improper way to respond. And then meta-ethics, this asks the fundamental questions. Well, where do these rules and standards come from? And is there truly a right and wrong that exists objectively in this reality that we live in? Things that are true or right for every person, for all time, and for all places. And then finally, why should we be ethical in the first place? Why even bother going through this? Again, as we're looking at this past Sunday, okay, as we're looking at this past Sunday, when we talked about where do ethics come from, we said 3 sources, right? First is reason. We can just sit down and we can reason through that we know that you shouldn't torture babies for fun. We can just reason that out on our own. That's not a difficult thing to do. We can just sit down and with the minds that we have, we can reason these things out. We don't necessarily need God for this. The second, the prescription-based systems say no. Where these principles, these standards come from, is if someone has prescribed them to us, someone in authority. We as believers here obviously recognize that it's God Himself who is the authority that provides that direction, that provides the standards by which we live and conduct our lives. But others may say, no, I may not believe in God, but the government is that source. Or maybe in a closed situation, maybe it's our parents or mom and dad. They're the authority that have set up the rules by which we conduct our lives, and I've adopted their rules as my rules as I conduct my life. Third is evolution, either biological or cultural. Biological, well, we've just evolved this way. It's a mechanism that has evolved that allows us to coexist with one another, that allows us to survive. Evolution supposedly says it is the one driving force is survival, that the species survives. So ethics is just a coping mechanism so that we can survive. Cultural evolution says, well, no, it's not biological, but it's sociological. As we have lived for thousands and thousands of years, we've just learned what's the best way to get along with one another, and we've adopted these rules or standards as a means by which we can live with one another and ultimately flourish. So those are the three basic responses to the question, where do our standards come from that we use to make our decisions as it relates to right and wrong? The second question we looked at there we go. Is do good and evil actually exist? And again, I think to all of us here, it's kind of a silly question. Well, of course they exist. But that isn't the general consensus in our society. You know, the so-called cognitive, the rational moral theories say yes, there absolutely is such a thing as right and wrong, as true and false. And it is objective. If everyone in the world believes this thing is right, it may still be wrong, because it's an objective truth that's true for all people at all times and all places. That's cognitive moral theory. The non-cognitive say, no, that really morality doesn't exist. It's an illusion. We looked at the one theory, the moral error theory. I mentioned Richard Dawkins, well-known atheist. And if you listen to his logic, it makes sense. If we're just a bunch of atoms put together, we came here by chance, that's all that we are, there is nothing beyond the material. Well, what we are can't dictate what we ought to be. You can't get an ought from an is. That's logical from his standpoint, if indeed there is no God. So really, the idea that there is such a thing as right and wrong, as things that we ought to do, is an illusion. It's just an illusion that we see. The other theory, as it relates to non-cognitive, for whatever reason, this is hasn't woken up this morning. Maybe it's the weather. The other theory that we talk about is emotivism. And this is kind of very similar. Again, denies that morality exists. But what it says, when we're talking about right and wrong, or when we say murder is wrong or rape is wrong, we're really just expressing our opinion. It's just, you know what, I'm uncomfortable with that. And I'd kind of like you to join my team and kind of be uncomfortable with this as well. But it denies the reality of morality. Again, they're not real popular, so we're not going to spend any more time on that, but you should be aware that there are those that hold to these type of beliefs as it relates to morality. There's one more that we would look at as it relates to, does morality actually exist, or ethics, do they truly exist? And that is relativism-based systems, okay? In relativism-based systems, and it's kind of a midway point between the objective view and the non-objective view. The objective view says moral laws are real. They really are something. There's such a thing outside of humanity that some things are right and some things are wrong. Non-cognitive says, no, it's all an illusion. There is no right and wrong. There is no oughts in this materialistic world. Relativists, they're kind of in the middle. They're like, well, sort of. And what their position is, well, laws, right and wrong, it's real. They do exist. But they're not objective. They're not objective. They change. There's such a thing as morality, there's such a thing as what you ought or ought not to do, but it's not objective. It changes from time to time. As an example, slavery, right? 200 years ago, slavery was okay. not objectively, slavery was okay. That was something that was a part of the fabric of our society. Our society recognized that, accepted it. It was okay to have a slave. Today, that's no longer the case. It's a relativistic view of morality. There is no objective basis. It depends on the time that we're living. It depends on perhaps the location where you live. It depends on who you are as a person as to what is right and what is wrong. Now, interestingly, a survey was done, and the most recent one I could find by Barna was in 2002, so it's 24 years old. But they took a survey of people from our country, and they asked about the nature of morality, the nature of ethics. Is it such a thing as objective morality, or the things that are right and wrong at all times, in all places, for all people? Or is morality relative? It's relative to the times, relative to different circumstances. What do you think was the most popular response from the people in our country? How many of you think they believed that morality was objective? All right, a couple. How many believe that the majority of the people thought that it was relative? All right, a lot more. Well, that's what the decision was. That's what the majority of the people, and I say majority means more than 50%. Not a plurality means it was the largest number. The majority of the people believe morality is relative. It can change from time to time. It might be wrong today, but it might not be wrong over there, or it might not be wrong tomorrow, or it might be wrong for you, but not for you. What was fascinating, what percentage of people in our country do you believe or think that morality is relative? How many would think it was between 50 and 60%? Okay. How many believe it was between 60 and 70%? All right, that's a pretty big number. How about between 70 and 80%? Anyone think it was that high? We got a couple. How about between 80 and 90%? No takers there, so I assume no takers for 90 and above. 83% of Americans in 2002 said morality was relative.
Is there another name for that relativism, situational ethics?
Yes. Yeah, very similar to that. Very similar, yes. We'll be talking about that, yes. 6% of Americans said morality was objective. 6%. That's what you're dealing with, folks. When you're having these conversations, at lunch, in social media, wherever it is, that's the mindset that we're dealing with. And again, that's another reason why I think it's so important for us to understand the mindset of those around us. Again, remember, I referred to the men of Issachar who understood the times and knew what they should do. We need to understand where our society is today if we have that passion and desire to reach out to them with the truth. We need to know where they are. We need to meet them there and then bring them to the truth. Yes?
What would be some of the outstanding factors for the deterioration that we're experiencing now?
Okay. Well, what would be some of the factors that maybe led to this shift? I don't know if there's any one single one, but certainly I think at the very beginning of our class several weeks ago, we talked about the fact that if you take God out of the picture, right, you're going to end up with a distortion of reality. So I think that's a large part of it. I think another part is one of the attractions of relativism is it shows how tolerant you are. You believe one way, and I know you believe another, but you know what? That's okay. That's your truth, and this is my truth. It's seen as being tolerant. And again, if there's one virtue that is supreme in our land today, it's so-called tolerance. So I think that's a part of it as well. But again, when we do away with God, Romans 1 tells us that, right? God revealed himself, but they suppressed that knowledge, and what, professing themselves to be wise, they became what? Fools. They became foolish. But again, I want you to appreciate, that's the mindset. That's the mindset of the vast majority of people in our country today. Now, there's a lot of problems with relativism, and there are very easy ways that you can refute that. If we have time, it's getting a little bit off the subject of ethics, but if we have time, we'll maybe take 10 or 15 minutes to go over how we can refute relativism. But I just want you to appreciate that's where the majority of our society is today. So one last thing, and you're going to see some words here that, again, might be new to you. I don't know what the issue is today. Usually this changed quite easily. There we go. And it's the question of justification. And again, this is an important and a difficult question. It doesn't relate to the source. When we say, what's the justification for these standards that you're using, that you're applying? We're not saying what's the source, well, it's God or it's reason or something. No, it's saying what is it about that standard that makes that standard right? As an example, Mom, you talk to one of your kids and you say, I want you to go do this for me. You need to go do this. And hopefully the child doesn't respond, or maybe responds with the right tone. Well, why should I? Okay. You're asking me to do, well, why should I do what you just asked me to do? Why is it, Mom, that your command is right? Now, if the mother responds, well, because I said so. Okay. That tells you why the child should respond. Mom, you made the rule. You're in authority. You're the boss. But that doesn't tell you if her command is right. What if it's the wrong command? So justification deals with what is the justification for determining that that standard that we're using is right, that is correct. And this is, as I say, a crucial issue, again, in our culture today. You don't need to remember these terms. But relativism, again, relativism says, well, we really don't see an objective right or wrong. Everything kind of changes, so relativism doesn't really have a justification that it can give to you. It doesn't really offer a justification because there are no absolutes. There are no absolute right and wrong in relativism. In the non-cognitive form that we looked at, remember, that theory said there is no such thing as morality. It's an illusion. So there's nothing to justify. Again, it says morality is like saying, well, murder's the color blue. It's meaningless. There are no such thing as oughts. So again, for non-cognitive, there is no justification. For intuitivism, that position says that, there are some things we just know are wrong, and we just know are right. And so we don't really need any justification. It's just inherent. We just know it. And there actually is biblical support for that. We'll look at that probably next week, Romans 1, Romans 2, where God has put a law in our hearts that there are things that we just inherently know are right or wrong. Someone says, hey, this is going on. Do you think I should do this? And, without a lot of thought, without saying, let's pray, let's go to Scripture, we just say, that just doesn't sit right. I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. Intuitively, there are certain things that we know. That's that view. And then definism says that, look, there are indeed things that are absolutely right, that are absolutely wrong, that are objectively so. Certainly the Christian worldview would fall under this category, in that these ethical norms ultimately rest on God, but not simply on God, but on the character of our God. Something is right or something is wrong. The justification for that is because it comes from a God who is holy, who is righteous, who is just, who is loving, who is merciful. And that's the God that we are to imitate, and that's the God that we are to follow. In a few weeks, we're going to be talking about the Euthyphro dilemma. Anyone ever hear of that dilemma? All right, well, I hope once we discuss it, you'll never forget it, because it has to do with justification. And it's an argument that's been around for centuries. That is an attack on the basis of our Christian belief in right and wrong, in the nature of our God. But it comes to this question of justification. So I just throw that out there. We'll be getting to that, as I say, probably next week or maybe the week after that. But when we talk about justification as a believer, it isn't simply, well, God said it. It's the God who is, again, holy, righteous, and just. Because someone may say, well, what if God said you should murder? What if God said you should rape? Would that make rape right? Would that make murder right? Because God said it? No. No, that's an impossibility. Because our God, as I say, is a God of certain characteristics, certain attributes. And it is by virtue of his nature that's the justification for what is right and for what is wrong. So with that in mind, well, maybe the Lord doesn't want us to look at this slide. Okay. We're going to now transition from metaethics, which is, again, it's a foundational issue. Where do our rules come from? Is right and wrong truly objective? What is the basis? Why should we be ethical at all? And again, this is where the battleground is today, the metaethics. As a matter of fact, before we go to that, just this past week, I saw 2 videos of apologists having debates with atheists on ethics, and it was on the metaethics where that clash was taking place. Because it is a different world of different worldviews, isn't it? Whether you believe in a transcendent basis, God, or you believe in a purely non-transcendent, man-based ethical world. But now that we've kind of covered that, keep that in mind. Now we shift, okay, we see these different theories. Now, we take that next level down. What are these rules? What are these standards that we're going to use, that we're going to apply when we deal with ethical issues? This is where we're going. Once we're done this, no more new terms. From here, we go to how do we start applying this in our lives? What are the guidelines? But this is important, so I want you to hang in there with me as we go through these. We're going to start just with the consequentialism today. How do we decide when we're faced with an ethical issue? How do we decide what's the right and the wrong response? What we should or should not do? These are the 3 most common categories that are used in addressing this. And I want to say this up front. All of these have something to commend in them. They all have something to commend. But by themselves, outside of the role that God plays in this, we see how far defective and insufficient they are to ultimately address the issues that we're looking at. So, number 1, consequentialism. Again, normative ethics. Well, I don't know. There we go. Well, what that's supposed to look like, in 1945, August of 1945, the U.S. military detonated atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. That picture on the left is Hiroshima, and on the right is Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of people died in those attacks. The U.S. rationale, the basis for us dropping those bombs, was that the demonstration of this incredible power of these weapons would bring a more rapid close to World War II. 3 days after the second bombing on Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito of Japan chose to surrender. Many military scholars, philosophers have debated the ethical use of those atomic bombs during World War II. And in part of those debates, various questions have arisen. Would Japan have surrendered anyhow, whether we did or did not drop the bomb? How many lives really were saved by doing so? And how can we know how many lives were saved? Was the cost of innocent life worth the benefit of the bomb's apparent success in ending the war? Most moral defenses of using the atomic bombs have rested on consequential thinking, on consequentialism as a theory in evaluating the right and wrong of certain activities. Consequentialist theories, as hopefully the word would suggest to you, refers to any ethical theory where the act is secondary to the consequence. What is the consequence of the action that you have taken? And it's seen as almost a balancing act. Our goal, the foundation of consequentialism, are the consequences. Excuse me. What is the good that came out of this? What is the good that came out of dropping the bomb? What is the bad? And if we weigh them in the balances, which one prevails? Whichever one prevails determines what is right and what is wrong. It isn't the act itself. It wasn't the act of dropping the bomb. It was dropping the bomb right or wrong. No, that's not what consequentialists look at. They look at what was the result of dropping the bomb. And did the good outweigh the bad? Yes, sir.
Could you also call that the end justifies the means?
You sure could, and that's where we're heading. You're ahead of me today, which is pretty good. Yes. The catchphrase is the end justifies the means. We don't look at the act itself and make a judgment that was right, that was wrong. You murdered someone, that was right, it was wrong to murder. No, what were the consequences of that? And I'm going to show you, as time permits, a video of this. But this is basically this viewpoint. Now there's a couple different understandings of consequentialism. And I notice it also says teleological. Remember we said telos means goal or purpose? Remember we talked about that when we think about ethics, what's the goal or what's the purpose? Why are these ships that are on the ocean, why are we here in the first place? What is our goal? Well, again, teleological or consequentialism says, what's the goal of the action? What's the end result? And does the end result justify the means to get to that end result. Just very quickly, ethical egoism is a form of consequentialism. And what it says is that whatever will produce the greatest happiness or pleasure for you is what you should proceed and pursue in your life. Perhaps the first one to articulate that about 300 BC was Epicurus. And you probably heard about Epicureanism. His belief was that you should seek your pleasure as the highest goal. More recently, this past century, Ayn Rand was a very famous egoist. And let me just share what she said. She said, a person's own life and individual happiness was the ultimate good, and an individual's life should never be wasted on other human beings. Isn't that amazing? What contrast that is to Scripture and what the Word of God says. But that's this mindset. And I think we see that a lot today, don't we? People that are self-centered. It's, I, myself, and me, right? Whatever you need to do to get ahead, if you need to step on somebody else. I mean, this is a worldview. This is a standard that many individuals utilize as they make decisions in their life. I want that job, you want that job, well, maybe I can do something to sabotage you so I get that job. That's a mindset that we see today. So that's one form. I'll just mention Adam Smith was an egoist, and he's considered the father of capitalism. And the way he saw it was, if you pursue what's best for you, in the end, that will help society. And his argument was, well, let's say you want to make a lot of money and you want to be popular in your community, and you're a widget maker. Well, if you make really good widgets and they last, people will buy them and you'll get rich. If you make lousy widgets, people won't buy them and you won't get rich. So his argument was, be self-centered. Work for yourself, do what's best for you, and in the end, that'll kind of spread out over the rest of society. I think we know a little bit about human nature, and that actually doesn't work too well, does it? Because that self-centeredness is certainly contrary to what the Bible talks about when it talks about agape love, right? Which is self-sacrificing on behalf of others. And again, if you're living for yourself, how do you go from egoism to altruism, where you're looking to serve and to benefit those that are around you, which is clearly something God has called us to do? That's one form. The more common form of consequentialism is what's called utilitarianism. And this will finish up our class today. Utilitarianism takes egoism, but it expands it and say, no, what's the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Not just what's best for me, but what's best for all of society. So we're still looking at consequences. Any decision that has to be made, any judgment that you're making, it's not what you're doing, but the consequences that are significant. And if I'm doing, should I do this or should I not do this? Well, if I do this, what are the consequences? If I don't do this, what are the consequences? And which one has the best consequences? And frankly, it is almost it becomes a mathematical issue. Not ethical as we would, it's mathematical. Which decision has the best result? Things like, again, murder or rape or whatever, they aren't inherently good or bad. It's the outcome of them that determines the rightness of an action. Utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill, I just share it with you from the mid-1800s, kind of the father of this utilitarianism. A morally good act is one that will produce the best consequences. The best consequences is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Happiness is synonymous with pleasure. And then he adds in there the harm principle, which says as long as you're not harming someone, your freedom to pursue whatever should not be restricted. Consensual sex. It's not harming anyone else. So if you find pleasure and fulfillment in that, nothing wrong with that. Euthanasia. Well, look, it's your life, and if you want to take your life, it's not harming anyone else, well, then you have a perfect right to, you'll be out of pain. You'll no longer be depressed. All those things will be gone. So again, the end justifies the means, the goal. And it said you can do whatever you want as long as it's not harming others, the harm principle. Again, I think, and I mentioned up here act and rule utility. Let me go over this very quick because there's a video I want to show you before we're out of time here. Act utilitarianism strictly looks at the end result of the act that you're doing. Rule utilitarianism says, well, we should have some rules. But the rules, such as, well, normally you should tell the truth, is not because truth-telling is inherently right, but because truth-telling usually results in a good end. So they apply some rules there. But this is utilitarianism. It's the result that you're looking at that determines the right and wrong of something, not the act itself. A couple of things very quickly. This is a common, you can't see it, but there are some tracks there. This is a common utilitarian mind exercise. You got 5 guys tied to a railroad track. You got another guy tied to a different track. The trolley's coming down to run over the 5 people. And you're at a place where you can change the direction of that trolley and you can divert it to the track with the 1 person. What are you going to do? If you're a strict act utilitarian, very easy. You're going to move the lever because the end result is you save 5 lives versus saving only 1. That's act utilitarianism. What's some of the problems with that? Well, some of the problems are, obviously, you're taking a decisive act to kill somebody, but how do you know that those 5 people aren't convicted murderers? And maybe that one on the other side, maybe that's someone who's going to discover the cure for cancer. I mean, there's a lot of implications that go into this, but this is a typical example that they use. Let me show you something very recent. In 2024, this gentleman, the CEO of United Healthcare, was shot in the back by a young man, murdered brutally, husband, father of 2. And this gentleman, use that term loosely, on his Facebook page said the world is a better place with 1 less CEO in it. And this is a little bit of what he wrote. He says, hot take, U.S. healthcare CEO assassinated. I can watch the footage all day. There are so many great memes out there, and I'll post a few of them at the end of this. Where do I begin? Pardon the language, United Healthcare sucks. In fact, all insurance companies suck. We really should have universal health care. No one should be making a profit off people being sick. Health care is a human right, so when United Healthcare CEO is murdered in broad daylight on the streets of New York City, lots of people cheer, including me. This was not a good thing. The assassin is no Robin Hood. Intellectually, we have to acknowledge that. And yet, I'm still giddy and liking and posting memes. It's like a guilty pleasure kind of deal. Do you see the mindset of that individual? Actually, that individual was here a couple years ago when we had, or 3 years ago when we had that discussion between the atheist and Abdu Murray. That's actually when I got to meet him. But this is the mindset. the end justifies the means. In his mind, if there was one less, healthcare CEO, then maybe this will cause a change in the insurance industry. And maybe they'll be more responsive to patients and their needs. And so that end justified the means of this man being brutally murdered. Again, if I were to say, is this an act or a rule, utilitarian view that this man holds, I'd say probably rule. Because he does acknowledge, you normally shouldn't murder people. It normally doesn't turn out well. But in this case, I'm giddy about it because of what the end results are. So standard number one is consequentialism. When we're faced with ethical decisions, what are the consequences of the decisions that I may or may not make? If you're a pure consequentialist, most of them utilitarian, what's the greatest good for the greatest number? That's the only thing that you're looking at. You're not looking at the act itself, but you're looking at the results. Should we as believers look at the results of our actions? Absolutely we should. But folks, that's only a small part of how we address ethical issues. Next Sunday, well, not next Sunday, the following Sunday, Lord willing, we'll be looking at the next theory, and this is one that I think most believers would fall into, the one that we'll be looking at in a couple of weeks. But again, keep in mind, this is the mindset of most of the people in our society today. This is the mindset. They're relativistic, and they act by the consequences, not the acts themselves. Let's learn from this. Let's be educated so we know how to give an answer to the questions that people ask us when these discussions come up. I went a few minutes over. I apologize. Thank you, and Lord willing, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.